The Japanese forces for the southward advance were to be primarily based upon the Southern Expeditionary Army Group commanded by Count Hisaichi from Saigon. He was the Japanese Minister for War in 1936 and 37. Before establishing the Southern Expeditionary Army Group, he was responsible for the Japanese army in northern China. The Japanese force to take Malaya and Singapore was the 25th Army under General Yamashita. Yamashita was a career soldier who graduated from the Japanese War Academy in 1905. He was an experienced and talented and focused soldier. He had studied German methods of mechanized warfare and was a thought leader in the military, although his ideas were not appreciated by some. He was a rival and a threat to the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, and would pay a price for this rivalry after his successful Malayan campaign. The other major organisations in the Southern Expeditionary Army were the 14th Army, designated to capture the Philippines, the 15th Army, allocated to Burma, and the 16th Army, which would capture the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. Just a quick word on the use of military terminology here. These Japanese armies, the 25th, 14th, 15th and 16th armies, in Western terminology would be called corps. A corps is two or more divisions grouped together. So when you see army in Japanese terms, it generally refers to a Western corps. When you see army group in Japanese terms, this refers to an army, which is usually a collection of several corps. Yamashita's 25th Army consisted of 3 divisions: the 5th Division, 18th Division, and the Imperial Guards Division. This represented a force of some 60,000 troops with supporting artillery and a tank group with 230 light and medium tanks. Air support was to be provided by the 3rd Air Division with 354 aircraft and additional support from the 22nd Air Flotilla, a naval organisation, of 180 aircraft. This made for a total air support force of 534 aircraft. Naval support was primarily given by elements of the Japanese Second Fleet. This included 2 battleships or battleship equivalents, 10 destroyers, 4 cruisers, 10 submarines, and 2 mine layers. Yamashita's strategy for capturing Malaya was simultaneous attacks through Thailand using his 18th Division and on the northeast Malay coast using elements of the 5th Division at Kota Baru. His Imperial Guards Division would initially support operations in Thailand and then move south to support the Malay campaign. Yamashita's approach was to concentrate forces and move quickly to exploit advantages and keep his adversary on the back foot. To do this, he took calculated risks with supply and logistics. As he advanced, Japanese air forces would be brought closer to the front as he captured British airfields. Overall command of the British forces in Malaya rested not, as often is believed, with General Percival, but with Commander Far East Command, Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham. Under his command were Lieutenant General Percival, commanding army units in Malaya Command, and Air Vice Marshal Pulford, commanding the Far East Air Force. The naval commander was Admiral Phillips, commander of the Eastern Fleet. There was no formal relationship between Brooke Popham's Far East Command and the Eastern Fleet. In fact, just before the Japanese attack, both Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham and Admiral Phillips were made jointly responsible for the defence of Malaya by London. The most senior Australian officer in Malaya was Major General Gordon Bennett, commander of the 8th Division. A veteran of Gallipoli, Bennett saw distinguished service in World War I. He was extremely ambitious and felt slighted that he was not offered the command of Australian troops in North Africa at the start of the war. He was to become a highly controversial figure for his actions in the Malay campaign. Group Captain John Mccauley was in charge of RAAF units in Malaya, in particular supervising the training and operations of 1 and 8 squadrons flying Hudson bombers. A 1919 graduate of the Royal Military College Duntroon, he transferred to the RAAF in 1924. He was to have a distinguished career both during and after World War II. Captain Collins was the most senior Australian naval officer at the start of the conflict in Malaya. He was the Assistant Chief of Staff to Admiral Phillips. The Australian Navy was effectively a fully integrated element of the British Navy. Collins' appointment to Admiral Phillips' staff illustrates the closeness of the relationship. Collins had, prior to his Singapore posting, gained great credit in the Mediterranean by sinking an Italian cruiser while in command of HMAS Sydney. He was to go on to more senior roles during and after the war. The Collins-class submarines in Australia are named in his honour. General Percival's Malaya Command consisted of some 88,000 troops, which included the 9th Indian Division, the 11th Indian Division, the 8th Australian Division, 2 brigades only, and Singapore Fortress troops. Air Vice Marshal Pulford commanded a total of 13 squadrons, which included 8 Royal Air Force squadrons, 4 Royal Australian Air Force squadrons, and 1 Royal New Zealand Air Force squadron. In total, he had approximately 160 frontline aircraft, which was considered half the number required to do the job against the Japanese. Admiral Phillips' Eastern Fleet included 2 battleships or battleship equivalents, 4 cruisers, and 7 destroyers, one of which was the Australian destroyer HMAS Vampire. The strategy for defending Malaya and Singapore was not devised by a single person. Through the intervention of Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, Admiral Phillips was sent to Singapore with some fast capital ships. This was intended to deter any Japanese attack on Malaya and Singapore. In sending a naval task force to Singapore, both Phillips and Brooke Popham, as I indicated before, were advised that they were jointly responsible for executing the British strategy in Malaya and Singapore. Independent of Churchill's actions in sending out a naval task force, Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham had devised a plan called Matador that was intended to preempt the Japanese invasion by, firstly, capture of potential Japanese landing points in Thailand, and secondly, establishing a defensive boundary across a narrow section of the Isthmus of Kra, effectively reducing the potential land border with the Japanese in Thailand, assuming the Japanese invaded Thailand, from over 200 kilometres of frontage to 100 kilometres of frontage. Before pressing on with the events of the Malayan campaign, some background is needed as to why the British strategy in Malaya and Singapore was, from the outset, a bit confused. Plans for defending Singapore extended back 20 years before Brooke Popham and Admiral Phillips were thrown together jointly to implement Britain's later strategy. Commencing in the 1920s, the British Admiralty developed a 3-phase plan for war with Japan. The first phase saw Singapore being defended for a period of up to 2 months while the British fleet was dispatched from Europe to the Far East. Phase 2 of the plan saw the British fleet established at Singapore as its base, and then from that base effectively blockading Japan. The third and final phase would be achieved when the Japanese, in their desire to break the British blockade of their shipping, came out to confront the British fleet. And, of course, the British destroyed the Japanese fleet. Because Singapore as a base was central to the British Admiralty's plans, in 1923 formal announcements were made for the building of a fleet base in Singapore, including its coastal defences. Less than 10 years after the decision to build a fleet base at Singapore, the Royal Air Force in 1932 claimed to the Imperial Defence Committee that it felt aircraft would be able to defend Singapore, a claim that the committee partly accepted. And as a consequence, the Royal Air Force started to build airfields progressively across Malaya, including into distant northern Malaya near the Thai border. By 1939, the Royal Air Force was now primarily responsible for Singapore's defence. And with war developing in Europe, the ability to send a fleet to Singapore became increasingly unlikely. It was decided that Singapore must be able to defend itself not for 2 months, but for up to 6 months. So by 1941, Singapore was a fleet base for a fleet that no longer existed. It was to be defended by aircraft, but these aircraft needed airfields. To defend the airfields that were to defend Singapore, the whole of Malaya now needed to be defended, which necessitated army units. For the army to defend the northern airfields near the Thai border, it was considered important to invade Thailand in order to defend Malaya, in order to defend Singapore. Although this summary of the Singapore strategy is a bit tongue-in-cheek, it is not too far from the truth. British, and by extension Australian, strategy was confused. A mere 3 weeks before Singapore finally fell, Winston Churchill questioned why forces were being expended on Singapore's defence when it had lost its rationale, which was the British fleet, and there was now more strategically important areas for Britain and Australia to defend, such as Burma. Consideration was given by Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff to cut losses in Singapore and evacuate it if possible. When the Australian government heard about these considerations, it reacted angrily and accused Churchill of a betrayal over Singapore. This poorly thought through response from Australia only served to make a bad situation worse. All serious consideration of an evacuation of Singapore stopped. This is not to suggest that an evacuation could have been mounted, but it shows that over 20 years, Singapore had developed a life of its own in the Australian imagination, to be defended no matter what. Small wonder that Brooke Popham's plans for the defence of a naval base now entailed the defence of all Malaya and the invasion of Thailand.